What's going on, guys? Tower number 9 here, and today we're going to be taking a look at the data from season 0.6 of the Take the Initiative Online League, which recently concluded. So yeah, let's get into it. This is the data from the general league phase, and we're going to be looking at what the meta is looking like. Um, First off, let's take a look here. So these are like the games. These are games that are time stamped, and as you can see, we have a log of a lot of different games. Um, One interesting thing is that there were definitely some trends in terms of different things being popular at different times. Late in the league, we see a really large number of wins for Sabine Wren, Sabine Energy Conversion Lab. So this is Green Sabine. It's become a really popular deck recently, and it did very well in this league. But if we go earlier in the season, you're not seeing a ton of Sabine wins, and in fact, Sabine isn't even really being played all that much. So, things evolved as it went on. Towards the end, we started seeing Sabine doing really well, though, and let's take a look at what that means in terms of overall win rates. So, with the overall win rates here, we have the most played leader being Boba Fett with a quite strong 58% overall win rate. Now, if we look at the breakdown by the different colors, interestingly, green boba was at 63%, but yellow boba was actually not even at 50, and red boba at 54. There was only one game played with blue boba, but it was a loss. So they sort of standard green boba pick, doing better than Boba Fett as a whole. Over here, we had Sabine Wren, and there was actually an interesting situation. So 66% overall win rate, and the second most popular leader, even though she wasn't popular at first, there was a huge surge in Sabine play later on. And the really weird thing here is that this 66% win rate for Sabine, we actually had two colors that were over that. One, so the double red Sabine had a 42% win rate, not doing very well. Blue Sabine, interestingly, was 50-50. Yellow Sabine did a little better than the average at 67%, but green Sabine was at 73%. This is a really high win rate. I think it might have actually been the highest win rate of anything that had at least 10 games played. So Green Sabine was doing really well into the field that existed at that time. Now, to be fair, I think that the season 0.5 tournament had been going on where there was a definite shift towards more control type decks. And, maybe people are going aggro to counter control, but whatever they were doing with Green Sabine, it was working well, really strong overall performance. Um, the third most played leader was Iden Versio, and interestingly, the most popular version of the deck for Iden was actually not the best. So for Iden, we saw 58 games played with Iden Green, but only a 48% win rate with that, not really doing very well. Four games with Iden Blue at 50%, so a little better, but Iden Red, only 16 games played. So this isn't a huge sample size. It's maybe similar to some of the things like Red Boba or Double Red Sabine, but the 16 games had a much stronger win rate with 11 out of 16 wins and therefore a substantially better performance than the more popular green Iden. And I personally think red Iden is stronger. I could be wrong, but I think this is the stronger version of the leader, and I am backed up by this league data, at least for this season, but of course, small sample size. And that could easily be attributed to other factors. So we're going to have to play some more games before we really figure it out. But at least based on these results, Green Iden, despite being quite popular as a deck, didn't do that well, while Red Iden was in a stronger spot. Um, some other leaders, so Green Krennic, also at least kind of popular, but did even worse than Green Iden. Also, interestingly, Red Krennic did way better, but only had 3 games. That's not really a real sample size. Um, Vader was played almost entirely as green, with a few games on Blue Vader. Green Vader had a 54% win rate, pretty good. Blue Vader didn't do so good. Chirrut had a strongly losing record. Interestingly, Green Chirrut won 75% of games, which is way better than the other colors, but also there were only 4 of them, so the sample size is not really there. Luke, despite being extremely popular in previous seasons, was not only not very popular, but also didn't have a great win rate. I'm not entirely sure what's happened with Luke. I think, maybe there needs to be some more exploration there. I do actually think he's strong, but he wasn't doing that well. Leia really underperformed Sabine. So in the past, Leia and Sabine were pretty close to each other and both like fairly strong competitive aggro decks. However, this time it really looks like Leia. So Leia Red, 37% win rate. That's worse even than the less popular Sabine builds. Not entirely sure what's going on there. Not a huge sample size necessarily, but a interesting situation where Sabine and Leia's paths seem to be diverging. I've preferred Sabine over Leia for some time in terms of an aggro leader. I know that Leia was quite popular in the past, though, but for whatever reason, the Leia decks seem to have fallen behind a bit. Emperor Palpatine actually doing the worst of any leader that has at least 10 games played. He has a 29% win rate. That is very poor. Unfortunately for Emperor Palpatine, he is a control deck that is very weak to aggro, and there is a lot of aggro. And honestly, I'm not even sure that he's fast enough to deal with mid-range sometimes. Han was doing okay, small sample size, but 50% win rate. Almost all those games on green. The one game on red, he won. The one game on blue, he lost. And then the rest of these are also all very small sample size, and they're all not only small sample size, but also very bad win rates. So that's kind of indicative of that's maybe indicative of these being weaker leaders that people aren't as excited about playing, or it might be something that's underexplored and waiting for someone to kind of figure it out and unlock it. I think there may be differences among the different leaders in this group as well. And also, there's one leader that was notably not here. There are only 17 leaders listed. As far as I can tell, IG88 was not even played. I'm gonna go here and search for IG80. Yeah, IG88 was not even played in this league, so he is truly suffering when no one was even willing to try him there. If we look at the leader matchup matrix here, there are some interesting results. I gotta zoom this out a bit. Okay, so there are some interesting results to look at here. So Boba Fett, most played leader and quite popular, had favorable matchups against a lot of different leaders, but interestingly, there were a few weak points. Boba had a negative win rate against Iden. This is Iden Versio, but the thing is kind of squished, but that's Iden. So Boba had a 39% win rate against Iden, a 33% win rate against Luke, and a 39% win rate against Sabine. And these are interesting numbers. So for Iden, it's not that surprising because Iden basically counters Boba. For Luke, I suspect this is low sample size, though I'm not confident, but um, we'd have to see. But the weird one is Boba having a weak win rate against Sabine, who in theory is one of the leaders that people play Boba to try and counter. I don't know if this is indicative of the new green Sabine decks being much harder for Boba to deal with, or whether or not it's a fluke, or people had been moving into anti-control configurations rather than anti-aggro and are being caught by surprise, and it will be different once they adapt. I don't know what the true answer is with this, but it's an interesting result to see Boba having some weaker matchups against Iden, Sabine, and Luke. So kind of odd there. Kind of odd there. Looking at some of the other leaders, if we look at Sabine herself, she has currently a bad win rate against Vader on here, but favorable against everybody else. As someone who is familiar with the Sabine versus Vader matchup, I feel very confident saying it is not a bad matchup for Sabine. I suspect this is low sample size. Um, at least if you assume that that is wrong and take everything else at face value, which I think is risky to do, Sabine is even or favored against everything in the game. I don't think that's correct. I don't think that's correct necessarily, but I think it is definitely a sign of how well Sabine did in this last part of the league. And then looking at some other ones, Iden here interestingly had a 0% win rate against Krennic. Suspect that's low sample size. Didn't do great against Han. Oddly had a 0% win rate against Jin as well. Again, suspect low sample size. Jin was barely even played. And yeah, overall the specific matchup data is kind of skewed and not really all that valuable because the sample size is not good enough. Like the sample size is barely good enough for leaders and like leader color combinations, and the sample size for matchups is much worse. Many of these matchups have literally zero games played for some of the less prominent characters. And additionally, if you look at like even some of the more used characters, like Boba apparently never faced off with Han during this league. Um, and so I don't think these matchup stats are as useful except for matchups between widely played characters. So I do think that it's interesting to like Boba versus Iden and Boba versus Sabine win rates, but I would not put really high stock in like Thrawn having a 0% win rate against Chirrut. You know, I just don't think that necessarily means all that much. Okay, so then if we look at the data when it's broken down like this by the specific leader and base combinations, we interestingly saw that the very successful Boba Green was the top most played deck, followed by the kind of mid Iden Green, which was a bit less than a 50% win rate, followed by the extremely strong Sabine Green, and then followed by a tie between Sabine Yellow, which was also very strong, though not quite as strong as Sabine Green, and then Darth Vader, who did a bit better than 50%, Vader Green, that is. And yeah, there are a few other interesting ones. Chirrut Green, you know, the 75% win rate's cool, but it's only 4 games. And then the Iden Red that we talked about earlier, having a significantly stronger performance than Iden Green, and but being substantially less played. Okay. So based on this league data, it's kind of interesting. You know, right now I would say this is evidence of Sabine Green being kind of the new deck on the block and having a really strong initial performance. I think that if we go back to if we go back to the overall log of the games being played, the Sabine Green trend did not start until substantially into the season. So there might be a few games with Sabine on the Energy Conversion Lab. Earlier, I had actually been testing it prior to the big spike in its popularity, but I'm not sure. I think I maybe played like once or twice with it in the league, and I think I might have even lost with it. So it's not. Yeah, or no, I had a double red Sabine, I guess, that I played and lost with over here. And then but I had been messing around a bit with a green Sabine test. And then but as we get deeper into the season, you know, all of a sudden we start seeing all these Sabine Energy Conversion Lab games, and a lot of them are wins. So, you know, just visually looking at this, I know it's a little hard to see, but you know, it looks like we started around the yeah, it looks like starting starting around and you know there are a few that are early up here, but I would say that the green Sabine trend really seemed to start around the really seemed to start around the 18th or so of February. There seemed to be a big spike in Sabine Green games, and lots of them were wins, and this pattern continued to the end of the season. So, you know, it'll be interesting to see whether or not that holds. I know that I'm gonna have another video where I go into the lists and some of the matchups for the end of league tournament. The end of league tournament lists and matchups are interesting because they tend to be a reaction to the meta at the end of the league. So we are not going to see all Sabine Greens, but we are going to see a lot of people thinking about how to beat that, I believe. So interesting stuff. And I would say the main story from the season 0.6 league data is the rise of Green Sabine, putting up by far the strongest performance in terms of win rate of any widely played deck, with other stories being Boba continuing to do well, though interestingly having seemingly poor matchups against the new Sabine the new Sabine builds, as well as against Iden. Iden is not that surprising because people are largely playing Iden to counter Boba. Iden is a control deck trying to counter Boba's mid-range, and Iden also is a bit more resilient to Sabine than some of the other control decks, thanks to her healing ability. Um, so Boba having a negative win rate against Iden isn't that surprising, but Boba having a negative win rate against Sabine is more of a surprise, and it'll be interesting to see how players adapt and whether or not those results will look different in the future. But yeah, that's gonna about do it for this one, guys. Hope that was informative, and I'll be back later with some more Star Wars Unlimited content, including both some more gameplay and a look at the tournament lists for the top cut of this season. All right, guys, I will catch you all later. Thanks for watching.